Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. And I'm your host, Mike Allen. Virtually everybody's been inside a library. I'm sure you have been too. So not much need to orient you to the topic of this week's show, libraries. But the thrust of the discussion is not only that the first public library in the entire country opened in Connecticut, but until then, access to knowledge in this country was confined to those who had the financial wherewithal to buy a membership in one of the subscription libraries. Well, here to tell us all about this incredibly important change in our country's development is the director of that first library, Karen Goodell, who's with the Scoville Library in Salisbury. She's going to be along in just a moment with our story. This week's trivia question: the call letters for this illegal pirate radio station were CFR. Where was the Connecticut team running the station that made history for their incredible broadcast in 1973? Stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you're going to know the topic for next week's show. I think we all tend to take libraries for granted a little bit. They're always there when we need them, and they all have access to information that even the internet doesn't have, at least not yet. Now, my wife's the library director, so I do have insights into the incredible array of information they offer, maybe more insight than you do. The full offering of a modern-day library would literally amaze you. It's simply a huge list that I guarantee you don't fully realize and appreciate. Well, having said that, it's important to note that Connecticut led the way in the U.S. with starting the idea of publicly funded libraries. And until the Scoville Library in Salisbury began operations, in this country you had to pay a membership fee for access to a subscription library. Well, here to tell us the story of how all this came about is Karen Goodell. Karen's the current director and steward of the nation's first publicly funded library, the Scoville Library in the extreme northwest corner of the state. So, Karen, it's a pleasure to speak with a professional librarian about the topic of libraries, because they are so important and have been so important to how society has developed, not just, of course, here in the United States, but around the world. But your particular library, the Scoville Library in Salisbury, holds the distinction of being the very first publicly funded library in the country. Didn't start off that way, and we'll get into all that, but let's maybe just start off talking about your views about what libraries did for society, back in the 16, 17, 1800s, when, books weren't really plentiful and these libraries started coming around. What were their role at that point in time?
Libraries way, way back in the day, as you know, most of them were membership libraries. People paid a small fee, but it gave them access to information. It was a way to distribute knowledge. Many times, of course, it was people from more elite families, but as time went on, the libraries did serve to sort of level the playing field, I guess, and give access to a greater number of people to the books and information. So they were, really very important. For the most part, you probably think the collections back in those days were mostly religious in nature. But we do find, and we still have some of those collections in our possession from the very first library that was here back in the 1700s. And they were also about things like, of course, history and travel and biographies. So it was a lot more robust than you might think.
So you've kept some of those books from the earliest days.
Well, yes, we do. There's 119 titles from the original library in Salisbury, which was started by a man named Richard Smith, and then from the Caleb Bingham Library, which is the one that gives us our little claim to fame, and we still have 61 titles in our collection at the library.
Now, when you talk about, for example, the distribution of knowledge, and let's focus for a second on these subscription libraries and why this was so important. When the printing press came around, the first book, of course, that was published was the Bible, and it was the first mass production of knowledge and information other than troubadours and minstrels going around and singing the news to people. And so libraries kind of stepped in and filled in this role. And at first, there weren't a lot of authors publishing books. I mean, it wasn't like we had Barnes and Noble back then. And so libraries really were the central repository, weren't they?
Yes, absolutely. And particularly where we are here in the little northeastern part of the country, and particularly around where we are in Connecticut, there's many libraries here that have been here since the 1700s.
Now let's talk for a second about this guy, Richard Smith. So this is back in 1771. So this is before the Revolutionary War. And he runs a blast furnace, which was not unusual for that area of the state of Connecticut, the Northwest Hills with all that iron ore. He came up with this concept to say, look, I'm going to buy 200 books from London, which was a lot of money back then. But I'm going to need some subscription help from, a few people. And I guess about 36 people joined up with him. Is that the story?
Yes. There are about 39 residents, and Smith brought 200 books from London. And so for a very modest fee, they could come to the library. There were several times a year to take out, I think they could take up to 3 volumes at a time. And then, return them at the next period when the library was open.
And I mean, my wife, as we've talked about, is in the business, and I know she has to keep her library open all the time. Back with Richard Smith's library, though, that was only open 4 times a year, the third Monday of every third month. So there was only 4 times you could even go to this library.
Exactly, yeah. So at that point, there was still very limited access, even for the people that could afford to pay the membership fee.
Now, one of the things I want to sort of touch on is that, libraries then and today, there's still actually a lot of similarities because it wasn't even in the earliest days just books. Libraries today are great meeting places for communities, and they were back then too, weren't they?
Absolutely. And that's one thing. The Scoville Library, when it was first built, which was it was completed in 1894, the library was actually the cultural center of town. It had an auditorium where they hosted concerts and plays, other events. And, likewise, to this day, we still do that kind of thing. We don't have an actual auditorium or stage anymore, but as you know, most libraries are really evolving into being the community centers for the towns, particularly in small communities like where we are in Salisbury.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you talk about, for example, this Caleb Bingham Library, let's sort of focus on that for a second. So this was the second library that came in, and it was, as I understood it, for youth. Is that true?
That's true, yes. So Caleb Bingham grew up in Salisbury, and then he moved on to Boston, where he was a bookseller and actually became, if I'm not mistaken, one of the founders of the Boston Public Schools. So he had an interest in education, and he wanted the youth in his hometown to have access to books and to reading. And so he took it upon himself to donate some books from his bookstore to the town of Salisbury to open this Caleb Bingham Library for Youth. And that was in 1803. At town meeting on April 9th in 1810, the town voted to draw from the town treasury the sum of $100 to help keep the library going. That's where we become the first publicly funded library in the country. We were the first to have a tax appropriation specifically for the support of a library.
Can you try and characterize the significance of what that $100 donation meant for the United States in terms of libraries?
I think it was significant in general that the town saw value in having access to books and reading for its community, and particularly because it was for children and for youth. And, placing value in educating the young people in the town, I think that's incredibly important.
And it also really marked the big change, the sea change in the United States in terms of libraries no longer being for the privileged few who could afford them, but now the public was going to start having access, correct?
Right, exactly. And I think that's sort of, like you said, there was sort of this evolution towards libraries becoming more of like a philanthropic venture for people, obviously still from elite families. Wealthy families were usually the ones that were opening these libraries, but libraries were sort of like missionaries. I mean, that's what people viewed them as, and bringing civilization and education to more people.
Now, anybody who's driven through downtown Salisbury has seen the Scoville Library. It's a stunning architectural just monument. And it's interesting, the Scoville family was the one that donated all the money, right? I guess it was Jonathan Scoville left $12,000, which was a ton of money back then, in his will to get it going. And one of his relatives, I guess Grace Scoville, put the tower clock in. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Jonathan Scoville, as you said, he gave the $12,000. He had a brother named Nathaniel who had several daughters, and Grace was one of them. And Grace gave the money for the tower clock, which is really unique itself because the tower clock is the only one that we know of in the country that plays the Parsifal sequence. But I will tell you, unfortunately, right now our tower clock, the clock is going, but the chimes have been out of commission for about a year now, which is sad. But we're working on it. It's really difficult to find someone that can repair that type of thing. It takes time. But the original building was built in the Richardsonian Romanesque style. The actual architects, though, were a firm called Stone Carpenter and Wilson. They're out of Providence, Rhode Island, and they designed some of the buildings on the campus of Brown University. Many people, when they come to the library, and I think this is true of a lot of the libraries in the area, they always ask, what was this before it was a library? They often think that it was a church or some other sort of, facility, but it was always a library. And I think it's important to note, too, these libraries were designed to be very welcoming, to feel homey, so that people would feel comfortable coming here and, spending time reading and gathering.
So let me also say that in your reading room, apparently over the fireplace, there is a stone carving from England. Can you tell us the backstory for that?
Yeah, so the stone carving is from the 1400s, and it came from the Salisbury Cathedral in England, and it was gifted to the library as sort of, I guess, a sister city, Salisbury, England, and Salisbury, Connecticut. It's been hanging there for all this time. It's a beautiful piece.
Now, I understand that despite the fact that you are technically a publicly funded library and receive money from the town, that you still also receive, I don't know exactly what proportion of your revenue, from private donations. Is that true?
That is true. We get about a third of our funding from the town, and the rest of it is through donations, fundraising, investments. And I think that's typical of many association libraries in Connecticut. And it's one of the things we sort of make an effort to educate the public, because people automatically assume if you're a public library that you're a municipal library, but that's not always the case.
Yeah, there are big differences there in funding. You're absolutely right. When you look at the building and you walk inside, I would imagine some people would expect that you have a room somewhere off the back with scrolls because it's so old and kind of Baroque looking, but actually you've got DVDs and streaming services. Modern libraries are quite something, aren't they?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we do. We offer everything that a modern library offers, as you mentioned. We consider that our digital space is sort of a branch of the library in a way, where people can always, if they want to, have access to our collections. But I think one of the wonderful things about having a library that's been around for this long is we do have, as I mentioned earlier, not only those original collections, a lot of them, but so many things that have been otherwise collected over the years, artwork and different memorabilia. We're sort of, I would say, the historical repository for the town in many ways.
So many libraries do fulfill that function. You know, the very first podcast episode I did, 175, 180 episodes ago, was with the outgoing director of the Mark Twain Library in Reading, and I asked her if she ever, felt the importance of working at the first library started by an author in this country. And she said she actually sometimes felt his presence at night when she was locking up alone. For you, you're working at a library that is the first publicly funded one in the entire United States. How does that make you feel when you walk in the morning? Is there a sense of pride?
Oh, absolutely. Very much so. One of the sort of special things that we do here, we've kind of made it a tradition now, we've done it for 2 years in a row, is we do sort of the insider tour of the library. And it's really important and wonderful for our staff because to learn as we're doing it. They're also learning about the history of the library in the town. And it's a chance for the people in our community to really see some of these very old things and understand the significance and the stories behind the collections that we have here. There's one thing I wanted to make sure I know, because this is, one of the wonderful things that happens being in an old library is that oftentimes we uncover new stories and new historical facts and things that, it happens all the time. But a couple of years ago, there was a man who lived out in Oregon. He was doing some research for his family history, and he knew that there was a portrait of his 10th, I think, or 11th great-grandfather that existed, and he wasn't sure where it was. He thought it was somewhere in western New England, and he was calling around to all different historical societies and things, and he even had an article published in the Hartford Courant about his search. And along the way, it led him to speak to our then town historian. He called her and asked her if she knew anything of this portrait. And she didn't really know much about it, but we were lucky enough to have her predecessor, the town historian, was still living. So Jean called Catherine, and she said, "Oh, the portrait of Andrew Warner is in the vault at the Scoville Library." And lo and behold, we went down. We have an area downstairs called the vault where we have a bunch of very old and valuable things. And the portrait that this man was looking for was there. Andrew Warner, who's in the portrait, which we recently had appraised, it's actually from the 1600s, so a 17th century portrait, which Mr. Warner brought with him when he came to the colonies from England. And he was one of the people that followed Thomas Hooker to a land in the South, and which then became Connecticut. So he was one of the founders of Hartford, Connecticut, and his ancestors settled out this way in Salisbury, and that's how we ended up with the portrait.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I can tell you from doing this podcast that only certain information is online on the internet, and that is only the information that's been digitized. Many libraries have books, documents, and records that aren't available online, and if you want to get a full picture of many topics, there's simply no substitute for a visit to your local library. I want to thank our guest for today's program. She is Karen Goodell, director of the Scoville Library in Salisbury. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, the call letters for this illegal pirate radio station were CFR. Where was the Connecticut team running the station when they made history for their incredible broadcast in 1973? Well, the answer is CFR stood for Concert Free Radio. And the Connecticut team behind this enterprising activity broadcast from the largest music concert in U.S. history at Watkins Glen in upstate New York with 600,000 persons in attendance. Next week on Amazing Tales, we're going to speak with the chief engineer for that station who was there and today remains the chief engineer for some of this state's largest radio stations. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and please stay healthy.